This surgeon did what she thought was right and operated on a beggar who needed help. That choice cost her dearly, as she was fired immediately. The surgeon was confused and hurt, and the reappearance of the beggar only worsened it. But when he showed his true identity, everything changed. Surgeon gets fired for operating on a beggar. She is amazed when he reveals his identity. It was a busy but not unusual day in the hospital's emergency room. That was until a beggar showed up with a severe injury. His shirt was stained from all the blood he lost, and he was asking for help, explaining he had been stabbed in his shoulder, and it didn't feel right. Shortly after the beggar entered, the ruckus started. One of the doctors in the emergency room approached the beggar and told him to keep his distance, refusing to treat the man. The beggar's face showed a mixture of surprise and worry. "Will no one help me?" he yelled out desperately while showing his wound. In the room beside the ER, Dr. Susan Christie was taking a little break when she heard the commotion becoming louder and louder. Wondering what was going on, she decided to take a look. When she entered the emergency room, her eyes grew wide as she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Near the entrance stood a homeless-looking man with a shirt drenched in blood while a doctor was urging him to get out. Her other colleagues seemed to agree with the doctor and were yelling and shouting at the beggar. "We can't treat you. It's hospital policy," she heard the doctor say. Susan stared at the scene in disbelief. Then she snapped out of it. "What are you doing? That man needs help," she screamed to get over all the commotion. She had never heard about such a policy, and even if it was true, she wasn't refusing treatment to anyone who needed it. She quickly assessed the beggar's condition and ignored her colleagues' watchful eyes. "This needs surgery," she mumbled under her breath. Susan then instructed the man to lie down and, against her colleagues' opinions, drove the bed toward an operation room. But she would soon discover there was more to it than she thought. While her team was preparing the beggar for surgery, Susan went to scrub in. While she was washing her hands, a fellow surgeon came in and said something very surprising. "If you continue, it will be the last thing you do at this hospital." It left Susan conflicted and confused. Susan couldn't believe what she had heard. She looked at the beggar on the operating table, and her mind was racing. Why wouldn't her colleagues help? Why the warning? Susan couldn't ignore someone who needed help. She was determined to operate. However, as she was performing the surgery, she noticed many colleagues were watching. She tried to ignore the weird circumstances and focused on the surgery. After an hour, Susan closed the wound with a final stitch, and the surgery was successful. She then went to her office to handle the paperwork, but when she entered, she was surprised to see all her stuff packed. Was this for real? Tears appeared in her eyes as Susan paced around in her little office while reading the dismissal letter left on her desk. It noted that Susan performed below expectations, but she knew better. "All I did was help someone in need. Why is this happening?" she whispered to herself in frustration. The situation confused Susan, but she knew she could do nothing now. She calmed down and decided to think about her next steps when she was home. She grabbed her box and walked toward her car, passing the beggar's room on her way. He appeared to be gone, which was very strange given his condition. Susan's mind continued racing as she reached her car. Why did her colleagues act so strange? Where did the beggar go? She opened her trunk and placed the box with her personal items inside, and as she closed it, Susan was startled by an unknown woman who asked about the beggar. Susan looked at the woman who just asked her if she helped a beggar. The woman was well-dressed and seemed very businesslike. Why was she asking about the beggar? With her mind still lingering on that question, Susan nodded to respond. After which, she was met with a wave of questions from the unknown woman. "What happened to him, and how is he?" the woman asked. Susan was a little overwhelmed by the sudden interest and looked at the woman with newfound curiosity as this situation got increasingly weirder. "I'm sorry. I don't know. As far as I know, he left," Susan said with a slight tone of frustration. The man was why she got fired, which hurt Susan, as she loved her job. But the woman didn't seem to catch the hint and kept asking questions. "I didn't know him," Susan reacted. I only helped someone who required help. And look where it got me." She let out a big sigh. And then the mystery woman observed Susan for a moment and then spoke again. "So, what happened with the other doctors?" she asked. The question made Susan's eyes widen in surprise. It was all very strange, she thought aloud when she recalled the situation. The woman seemed interested, and Susan explained what had happened. Susan was lost in her own story and didn't notice the woman was writing down some things on her notepad until she had finished speaking. It all seemed very peculiar, and all Susan wanted was to be home and relax. She said goodbye and drove off, but she couldn't stop her mind from spinning. Because during the drive, and even when she returned home, Susan couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Her colleague's weird behavior, the warning, and the fact that the beggar was suddenly gone while still recovering. Everything about the situation seemed off, and that feeling would soon be confirmed. The day went by, and Susan thought about her possibilities. As evening fell, she got tired from all her thinking. It was getting dark, so Susan turned on the lights and went to close the curtains. However, before she could, her body suddenly froze. On the other side of the street stood the beggar. For a moment, Susan stood at the window and stared at the man, who was definitely looking in her direction. Then, she quickly closed the curtains. Her heart was pounding, and her breathing was fast while her mind was working in overdrive. Who was he? Did he follow her? A shiver ran down her spine. This situation was now getting out of control. Was this why her colleagues acted so strange? Was the man dangerous, and was it a mistake to help him? Then why did her colleagues warn her so vaguely? Why did the hospital fire her? Each question brought more worries to her mind. What was happening? Susan shook her head, trying to get rid of all her thoughts. The day had been tiring. She was probably making more of it than it was. She took a deep breath and let it out again, trying to get herself calm again. When Susan felt more like herself again, she decided to go upstairs and put the day behind her, but then the doorbell rang moments after she turned off the lights in her living room. Instantly, her chest felt tight again, and her heart started to pound. Susan instantly knew who would be on the other side of the door, and she deliberated on what to do. With hesitation and doubt, she slowly approached the door. When Susan reached the door, she took a deep breath to muster some courage and opened it. Even though she expected it, her heart still leaped as she saw the beggar on her doorstep. The two of them stared at each other in silence. Susan was about to speak up when she noticed something different. Her mouth closed abruptly as she scanned the man before her from tip to toe. This man didn't look homeless at all. He was well-dressed and looked neat. But his face did look the same. Was it the same guy? What was going on? Susan took a hesitant step back and closed the door slightly. Her mind was working overtime. She felt a mixture of fear and doubt as the situation became more confusing. Her instinct was to close and lock the door, but Susan changed her mind within a second. There were just too many questions on her mind that needed answering. She confronted the man. "Who are you? What are you doing here? How did you know I live here?" Susan's voice was filled with panic and fear. She was rambling on, and it was hard for the man to understand what she was saying after the first few questions. "I can explain everything," the man said gently. "I owe you an explanation after saving my life," the man continued in his calming voice. Susan's head was spinning, and her breathing was quick, but she started to regain control. "I can explain everything," he repeated. "But you must come with me." Susan was hesitant but knew she couldn't live with all these questions. All the questions flew through Susan's mind, and she was going crazy. Her whole life had turned upside down ever since she saved this man. The least he could do was get her some answers. As he said, he owed her an apology. "Fine," she eventually said with some hesitation. Susan followed the man to his car. This made it clear to her that he wasn't the beggar she thought he was. The car ride was silent, which made Susan second-guess herself. Was this the right decision? Was she in danger? But before she could convince herself it was the right choice, the car stopped. Susan looked around, and a frown appeared when she saw they had stopped in front of an office building. What were they doing here? Why would she need to come here to get answers? The man gestured for Susan to follow, which she did doubtfully, not knowing the surprise she was about to get. The office building was dark and silent. The more they progressed in the building, the more Susan felt like she had made a mistake coming with the man. Then he suddenly entered a room, and when Susan followed, she was shocked to see the woman from the parking lot inside. What was going on? Susan froze in the doorframe as she saw the mystery woman, and the shock was readable on her face. The man noticed it and quickly started explaining. We're sorry for all the secrecy, but you don't have to worry. I'm an investigative journalist, and this is my boss, he said, pointing to the woman. Investigative journalists? Susan repeated, confused. Now, it was the woman's turn to speak. She explained that they were investigating the hospital Susan worked at to find the truth behind some information they had received. We got an anonymous mail that informed us that the hospital was involved in malpractice, the woman said seriously. Susan was shocked to hear this. Malpractice? At her hospital? That couldn't be. But the woman continued by saying they quickly found out there was truth to the information. Susan's mind raced as she recalled the strange situation with a new look. Was your look and wound part of the investigation? She asked the man. The man looked up in surprise. My look was, he stated with a slight smile. I disguised myself as a beggar to blend in and avoid attention. He explained there was one suspect on their radar and wanted to follow that person to gain more information about the scandal. But then, the man's look turned dark suddenly as he rubbed his shoulder. The wound was certainly not part of the plan, he answered. He explained that the suspect was a doctor at the hospital, so he followed him inside. It turned out that was a mistake because it all went horribly wrong after that. Once inside the hospital, the doctor quickly realized a beggar was following him. The doctor slipped inside a door, and the beggar followed without hesitation. The door led to a utility closet, and the doctor confronted the man. It led to a skirmish in which he was stabbed with a surgery knife. Susan let out a yelp in surprise. A doctor stabbed this man? She listened in disbelief at how the man continued his story. He could get to the ER quickly because he was already inside the hospital, but so could the doctor. That doctor was why nobody wanted to help him. Except you, he said. I'm very thankful for your help and sorry I left so abruptly, the man said to Susan. But I was afraid. Susan looked at him in surprise. What did he mean he was afraid? But before she could ask, he explained he was worried the man he was following would hurt him again. Or worse. The man walked around hoping to come across her to thank her, but as he did, he found out that Susan had been fired. It was never my intention to get you fired, and I'm very sorry for that, he said, his voice filled with regret. But this gives us a unique opportunity. What opportunity? Susan asked curiously, and this time, the woman responded. She explained that she approached Susan in the parking lot to ensure she wasn't involved with the corrupt surgeon or any malpractice business in the hospital. Of course not. Susan exclaimed, and the woman nodded. And that's why we need your help, she said. The journalists explained that they could use Susan's inside knowledge and personal experience to shine a light on the malpractice that was happening in the hospital. The situation around your firing is an attempt to hide everything that is going on, the man said, explaining that was the mistake they had been waiting for. Susan's mind was racing as she listened to the journalist's story, and her eyes grew wider and wider. It all seemed so impossible that this was happening at her hospital without her knowing, but now she thought about it, it was plausible. Without any further hesitation, she agreed to help. After Susan agreed to help, the journalist quickly turned the situation into a high gear. They showed her all their research and the intel they had gathered. And Susan became a better companion than the journalist ever imagined. With her help, they could turn everything they gathered into concrete evidence. Over the following days, the trio worked hard to complete the entire project. It shed light on the malpractice situation inside the hospital and featured a chapter about the firing of Susan. When it was fully completed, the journalists published it on their platform, marking the beginning of many changes. Because the days after the publication, the big media picked up their research. Their investigation was covered nationwide, and the hospital received much negative attention. The journalists played their part and went on TV shows explaining what they had found and the process behind their investigation. But it didn't end there. Due to all the negative attention and coverage surrounding malpractice, the hospital was forced to undergo serious reorganization. The doctor who stabbed the journalist was fired and prosecuted alongside some of his associates. After that, the hospital contacted Susan and offered her a new job. Everything was going according to plan. Susan was offered the job of department head. She was tasked with ensuring the hospital continued going in the right direction. She gladly accepted the job but did negotiate a nice pay rise after the hospital let her go so easily not so long ago. Under her command, the hospital would soon flourish.